13 quarterbacks, 6 seasons, 0 answers. That's the record Kevin Stefanski left behind in Cleveland. And when Dan Orlovsky tried to defend him on national television, Cam Newton wasn't having any of it. What happened next became one of the most explosive debates in recent sports media history. Newton came with facts. He came with frustration. And he came with a message that resonated with every fan who watched the Browns stumble year after year. This wasn't about hurt feelings or hot takes. This was about accountability. This was about standards. This was about what it actually means to lead an NFL franchise. Orlovsky painted Stefanski as a misunderstood genius waiting for redemption. Newton painted him as a coach who failed at the single most important job in football, developing quarterbacks. And when the dust settled, the evidence was overwhelming. But what most people don't know is just how deep this rabbit hole goes. From questionable game decisions to alleged locker room manipulation, the full story of Stefanski's Cleveland tenure reveals something far more troubling than simple bad luck. This is the untold truth about what really happened to the Cleveland Browns. Dan Orlovsky has built a reputation as one of sports media's most analytical voices. Former quarterback turned commentator, he brings genuine insight to football discussions. But on this particular day, Orlovsky stepped into territory that would blow up in ways he never anticipated. The topic was Kevin Stefanski, the recently fired Cleveland Browns head coach who walked away from one of the most chaotic tenures in recent NFL history, and Orlovsky was ready to defend him. His argument sounded reasonable on the surface. Stefanski is still respected around the league. He's a 2-time Coach of the Year. Front offices know what he's capable of. According to Orlovsky, the Cleveland situation was messy, but it wasn't entirely Stefanski's fault. Ownership made questionable decisions. The quarterback room was unstable. The circumstances were nearly impossible. In Orlovsky's view, Stefanski deserved grace. He deserved another chance. And more importantly, he deserved protection from critics who didn't understand the complexities of coaching at the highest level. For a brief moment, it looked like Orlovsky had framed the narrative. Media personalities nodded along. The conversation seemed ready to move toward inevitable redemption arcs and future opportunities. But then Cam Newton spoke, and everything changed. Newton didn't ease into his response. He didn't offer polite disagreement or diplomatic hedging. He came out swinging with the kind of directness that makes television producers simultaneously nervous and thrilled. His voice carried weight. Not just because he's a former MVP, but because he's someone who lived the NFL experience. Someone who knows what it feels like to be a quarterback searching for stability, structure, and belief from a coaching staff. Newton's first move was surgical. He asked a simple question. How many quarterbacks did Stefanski go through during his time in Cleveland? The answer landed like a bomb. 13. 13 different quarterbacks in 6 seasons. That number alone shifted the entire conversation. Orlovsky tried to push back. He pointed to circumstances, injuries, roster decisions that were out of Stefanski's control. But Newton wasn't buying it. Not even for a second. According to Newton, the quarterback carousel wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern. And patterns don't lie. When you cycle through that many signal callers without developing a single one into a reliable long-term answer, something is fundamentally broken. The issue stops being about talent. The issue becomes leadership. It becomes philosophy. It becomes the inability to create an environment where quarterbacks can actually grow and succeed. Newton made another crucial point that resonated deeply with fans and analysts watching. In the modern NFL, everything flows through the quarterback position. Championships are built on stability under center. Dynasties are created when franchises find their guy and build around him. Coaches who understand this thrive. Coaches who don't understand it fail. And Stefanski had 6 years to figure it out. The intensity in Newton's voice told the full story. This wasn't personal grudge. This wasn't jealousy or bitterness. This was genuine frustration from someone who dedicated his life to football and understands the stakes. Newton pointed out that coaches aren't just hired to design plays. They're hired to develop players. They're hired to make decisions that put people in positions to succeed. And when you go through 13 quarterbacks without a single success story, the verdict writes itself. Orlovsky tried to steer the conversation towards scheme and structure. He highlighted Stefanski's offensive background. He mentioned the respect Stefanski commands in coaching circles, but Newton refused to let the discussion drift into abstract theory. Results matter. Wins and losses matter. And when you finish with a losing record after 6 seasons, no amount of whiteboard brilliance can save you. What made this exchange so compelling wasn't just the disagreement. It was the contrast between two completely different worldviews. Orlovsky was speaking from the media perspective, analyzing football like chess, where pieces move according to logic and intention. Newton was speaking from the trenches, from locker rooms where trust is everything. From practice fields where development either happens or it doesn't. From game days where coaching decisions either lift players up or leave them stranded. The debate spread across social media within minutes. Fans piled on. Former players added their voices. Analysts who had quietly questioned Stefanski for years suddenly felt validated. Newton had cracked something open. He had exposed a gap between how certain coaches are protected in media narratives and how they're actually viewed by those who understand the realities of professional football. Orlovsky found himself on the defensive, not because his points were entirely wrong, but because Newton's points were undeniably stronger. When you have 13 quarterbacks and 0 franchise solutions, you don't get to hide behind complexity. You don't get to blame circumstances forever. At some point, accountability kicks in. At some point, the common denominator becomes impossible to ignore. Newton said it plainly. Stefanski's firing wasn't harsh. It wasn't premature. It wasn't unfair. It was overdue. And that statement echoed louder than anything else said during the entire segment. Because deep down, most football observers knew Newton was right. They had watched the Browns struggle. They had watched quarterbacks come and go. They had watched promising talent enter Cleveland and leave damaged or forgotten. This wasn't about one bad season. This wasn't about one unlucky break. This was about a body of work that told a consistent story. And no matter how Orlovsky tried to spin it, that story wasn't flattering. But Newton wasn't just throwing opinions around. He had receipts. He had specifics. And he was ready to lay out exactly why Kevin Stefanski's tenure deserved every ounce of criticism coming its way. Numbers don't lie, they don't spin, they don't protect reputations or craft convenient narratives. And the numbers surrounding Kevin Stefanski's quarterback management in Cleveland tell a story that's impossible to argue with. 13 quarterbacks in 6 seasons. That's not a stat you can explain away with bad luck. That's not a figure you can dismiss as circumstances beyond control. That's a pattern screaming for attention. Let's actually name them. Case Keenum, Nick Mullins, Deshaun Watson, Jacoby Brissett, Baker Mayfield, Joe Flacco, PJ Walker, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, Jeff Driscoll, Jameis Winston, Bailey Zapp, Dylan Gabriel, Shedeur Sanders. Read those names again. Some are veterans with legitimate NFL experience. Some are young talents with real upside. Some are journeymen trying to extend careers. The range is enormous. The talent levels vary wildly. And yet, under Stefanski's leadership, not a single one emerged as the long-term answer. Think about what that actually means. In the modern NFL, the quarterback position is everything. It's the foundation of every successful franchise. Teams spend years searching for their guy. They invest draft capital, cap space, and organizational energy into finding stability under center. When they find it, championships become possible. When they don't, the entire operation stalls. Now compare Stefanski's Cleveland tenure to successful franchises during the same period. Kansas City found Patrick Mahomes and built a dynasty around him. Buffalo invested in Josh Allen and transformed into perennial contenders. Philadelphia committed to Jalen Hurts and reached the Super Bowl. Baltimore built their identity around Lamar Jackson. Cincinnati rode Joe Burrow to conference championships. The pattern across winning organizations is obvious. Find your quarterback, develop your quarterback, trust your quarterback, win games. Cleveland did none of that. Under Stefanski, the quarterback position became a revolving door of uncertainty. Players arrived with potential and departed without progress. Some regressed dramatically. Others were never given real opportunities to grow. The environment that should have fostered development instead created chaos. And here's the key point Newton emphasized repeatedly. When the coach is the constant and the failures keep happening, the coach becomes the common denominator. It's basic logic. If 13 different players cycle through the same system without success, the system itself requires examination. The philosophy needs questioning. The leadership demands scrutiny. Orlovsky tried to deflect by pointing to external factors: ownership decisions, roster construction, injuries, bad timing. And sure, some of those factors played roles. But 6 years is an enormous sample size. That's not a momentary setback. That's not a brief, rough patch. That's half a decade of evidence pointing in one direction. Consider the opportunity cost as well. While Cleveland churned through quarterbacks, they weren't building. They weren't developing continuity with their offensive line. They weren't establishing chemistry between receivers and their signal caller. They weren't creating an identity. Every time the quarterback changed, the entire offensive infrastructure had to reset. Plays that worked with one guy didn't work with the next. Timing routes fell apart. Protection schemes needed adjustment. The constant turnover infected every aspect of the operation. And yet somehow, Stefanski emerged from each failed experiment with his reputation largely intact. The media narrative focused on circumstances, on Deshaun Watson's off-field distractions, on Baker Mayfield's personality, on veteran quarterbacks arriving past their prime. Always something external, always something beyond coaching control. But at what point does the excuse factory shut down? At what point does accountability actually land where it belongs? Newton made this point with particular force. He argued that the job description of an NFL head coach includes quarterback development. It's not optional. It's not a bonus if you get around to it. It's the fundamental responsibility that separates successful coaches from failures. And when you evaluate Stefanski against that standard, the verdict becomes overwhelming. Successful coaches create environments where quarterbacks can learn. They build protection schemes that keep young players confident. They design plays that highlight strengths while hiding weaknesses. They communicate expectations clearly. They show faith in their players publicly while holding them accountable privately. They make quarterbacks better. Stefanski had 13 chances to demonstrate that ability. 13 opportunities to take raw talent or experienced veterans and mold them into something valuable. 13 chances to prove he understood the most important position in sports. And 13 times he came up empty. The sample size argument matters enormously here. Bad luck explains one failed quarterback development, maybe two in extraordinary circumstances. But 13? That's not misfortune. That's not randomness playing out unfairly. That's systematic failure. That's evidence of something broken at the core. When Stephen A. Smith eventually joined the conversation, he made this exact point with characteristic force. He asked a simple question that cut through all the noise. Somewhere along the way, doesn't the coach bear responsibility for not finding anyone, not developing anyone, not elevating a single quarterback into a legitimate starter? The answer is obvious. Of course he does. The entire purpose of having a head coach is to provide leadership, direction, and development. When those elements consistently fail, the coach fails. No amount of scheme talk changes that reality. No amount of praise for play design erases the fundamental truth. Stefanski's supporters point to his two Coach of the Year awards. They highlight his offensive background. They mention his calm demeanor and professional approach. But awards don't win games. Background doesn't develop players. And demeanor means nothing if the results don't follow. What Cleveland needed was a quarterback whisperer. What they got was a quarterback carousel operator. And the numbers prove it beyond reasonable doubt. And no quarterback situation captured this failure more dramatically than what happened with Deshaun Watson. The Deshaun Watson experiment was supposed to change everything for Cleveland. Instead, it became the most visible symbol of organizational dysfunction in recent NFL history. And Kevin Stefanski was standing right in the middle of it, unable to stop the collapse or even slow it down. When the Browns made their move for Watson, the football world gasped. Not just because of the off-field controversies that followed him from Houston, but because of the price tag. Cleveland handed Watson a fully guaranteed contract worth $230 million. Let that sink in. Every single dollar guaranteed. It was unprecedented. It was risky. And it placed enormous pressure on everyone in the organization to make it work. Now here's where the coaching question becomes impossible to avoid. The Browns knew exactly what they were acquiring. They knew about the distractions. They knew about the potential suspensions. They knew the transition wouldn't be smooth. And they committed anyway, betting that their coaching staff could navigate the complexity and coax the best out of a quarterback who had once been among the most dynamic players in the league. That bet failed spectacularly. And while Watson himself bears significant responsibility for his decline, the on-field regression that happened under Stefanski's watch demands explanation. Because the Deshaun Watson who arrived in Cleveland looked nothing like the Deshaun Watson who terrorized defenses in Houston. The explosiveness vanished. The pocket presence disappeared. The timing and rhythm that made him special evaporated almost immediately. Some will point to the layoff from football. Watson missed significant time due to his suspension, and rust was inevitable. That's a fair consideration. But rust explains early struggles. Rust explains a rough few games while a player finds his footing again. Rust doesn't explain sustained mediocrity across multiple seasons with no signs of improvement. Stefanski's offensive system was supposed to maximize quarterback talent. That was the entire selling point of his hiring. He came to Cleveland as an offensive guru, someone who could design schemes that made any quarterback look better. He had success with Kirk Cousins in Minnesota. He was supposed to elevate whoever lined up under center. With Watson, he failed completely. The scheme didn't adapt to Watson's strengths. The play calling didn't account for his instincts. The protection breakdowns became routine. And instead of Watson regaining confidence with each game, he seemed to lose more. The spiral was visible to anyone watching. A quarterback who once extended plays and created magic became hesitant, uncertain, and mistake-prone. The worst part is that Stefanski had warning signs from the very beginning. Houston Watson and Cleveland Watson were clearly different players. The speed wasn't there. The anticipation wasn't there. The ability to process defenses at elite levels had degraded. A sharp coach would have recognized this and adjusted immediately. A great coach would have designed an offense that worked around these limitations while rebuilding confidence slowly. Instead, Cleveland kept running the same system, the same expectations, the same approach that wasn't producing results. And week after week, Watson looked worse. His confidence cratered. His decision-making suffered. His body language told the story of a player who no longer believed in himself or his situation. Fans watched this unfold with growing frustration. They had invested hope in the Watson acquisition despite the significant controversies. They wanted to believe the gamble would pay off. And when it became clear that the situation was deteriorating, the questions naturally turned toward coaching. Why wasn't the system adjusting? Why weren't the play calls changing to help a struggling quarterback? Why wasn't there visible progress in any direction? These questions had no satisfying answers. And as the losses piled up, the narrative around Stefanski began to shift. Even supporters had trouble defending the Watson situation. You could blame the contract on ownership. You could blame the initial decision on the front office. But once Watson arrived, his development became Stefanski's responsibility. His performance became a reflection of coaching ability. And by every measurable standard, that performance was disastrous. The financial commitment made everything worse. Cleveland couldn't easily move on from Watson. The guaranteed money locked them into a relationship that wasn't working. Every game became a reminder of the miscalculation. Every poor throw highlighted the gap between expectation and reality. And Stefanski had no answer. What made this particularly damaging was the opportunity cost. The years spent trying to make Watson work were years not spent developing younger alternatives. Draft picks went toward surrounding Watson with talent instead of building for the future. Cap space remained tied to a quarterback who wasn't producing at anywhere near his contract value. Critics will argue that Stefanski inherited an impossible situation, that no coach could have made Watson work given all the circumstances. But that argument has limits. Great coaches find ways. Great coaches adjust. Great coaches refuse to let bad situations become hopeless ones. And Stefanski simply didn't demonstrate that ability during the Watson years. When you step back and look at the full picture, the Watson disaster represents everything wrong with Stefanski's quarterback management philosophy. There was no flexibility. There was no creativity in problem solving. There was no apparent plan B when plan A clearly wasn't working. Just repetition of the same approaches that kept producing the same failures. And here's the damning detail. Other quarterbacks on that same roster showed flashes when given opportunities. They weren't perfect, but they competed. They showed signs of life. Yet Stefanski remained committed to Watson far longer than results justified, almost as if admitting failure wasn't an option. That stubbornness became a theme. A coach unwilling to adapt. A coach unwilling to acknowledge when approaches weren't working. A coach who seemed more interested in proving his original decisions correct than in actually winning football games. But the Watson situation was only the beginning of the questions. Because what happened with Shedeur Sanders revealed even deeper problems. Shedeur Sanders arrived in Cleveland with expectations that few rookie quarterbacks carry. Son of NFL legend Dan Sanders, he had built his own reputation through dominant college performances, natural leadership ability, and a football IQ that scouts raved about. He wasn't just famous by association. He had earned attention through his own play. And when the Browns selected him, hope flickered that maybe this time would be different. It wasn't. Under Kevin Stefanski's guidance, the Shedeur Sanders experience became another chapter in Cleveland's ongoing quarterback tragedy. But this time, the failures were harder to excuse, because with Sanders, the mismanagement was visible from the very first days of training camp. The decision that set the tone came early. Stefanski chose not to give Sanders any first-team reps during camp. Let that sink in completely. A rookie quarterback with all the tools to develop, surrounded by veteran teammates he needed to build chemistry with, was deliberately kept away from the starting offense. He practiced with backups. He ran scout team looks. He watched instead of participated. There's no universe where that makes developmental sense. Quarterbacks grow by getting reps with the players they'll eventually need to perform with. Timing routes require practice together. Protection communication demands live experience. The subtle rhythms that separate good offenses from great ones only develop through repetition. And Stefanski denied Sanders all of it. The justification at the time was thin. Some suggested Stefanski was protecting Sanders from early pressure. Others speculated it was about maintaining veteran hierarchy. But whatever the reasoning, the result was predictable. Sanders entered real game situations without the foundational work necessary to succeed. And then came the opposite extreme. After denying Sanders meaningful practice time, Stefanski suddenly threw him into live action. Not in garbage time, not in low-stakes situations, but in games that mattered, with the season on the line. The whiplash was stunning. From no opportunity to overwhelming opportunity, with nothing in between. This approach violated every principle of quarterback development. Young players need incremental challenges. They need to build confidence through small victories before facing the full weight of NFL defenses. They need to trust their teammates and their scheme before pressure moments arrive. Sanders received none of that preparation. Yet somehow he competed. Despite every structural disadvantage, Sanders showed exactly why scouts had been so high on him. He demonstrated poise under pressure. He made throws that veterans struggle with. He commanded the huddle like someone who belonged. The talent was obvious to everyone watching. But instead of building on that talent, Stefanski's system seemed designed to undermine it. The protection schemes left Sanders exposed. The root concepts didn't match his processing strengths. The coaching staff sent mixed signals about expectations and roles. It was chaos disguised as a plan. The most revealing aspect was how Sanders responded to adversity. Lesser players might have folded. Rookies thrown into impossible situations often lose confidence and spiral downward. Sanders did the opposite. He studied film relentlessly. He maximized every snap he received. He refused to make excuses even when everyone watching could see the excuses were legitimate. That resilience told the real story. Here was a player determined to succeed despite his circumstances. A player who understood professional standards and held himself accountable. A player who could have blamed coaching and been completely justified, yet chose to focus on improvement instead. And still, Stefanski found ways to sabotage the situation. Game after game, decisions seemed calculated to prevent Sanders from establishing himself. Questionable substitution patterns. Bizarre play calling sequences in crucial moments. An apparent reluctance to let the young quarterback take command even when he was clearly the best option on the field. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Talented quarterbacks entered Cleveland with promise and departed damaged, doubted, or stalled. Baker Mayfield arrived as the #1 pick and left as a question mark. Deshaun Watson arrived as a proven star and became a shell of himself. And now Shedeur Sanders, with all his gifts and determination, was being mishandled in real time. Newton made this point with particular force during his debate with Orlovsky. He emphasized that this wasn't coincidence. When the same outcome keeps happening with different players, the system is the problem. The coaching philosophy is the problem. The leadership is the problem. Sanders represented Cleveland's best chance at finally breaking the cycle, young enough to develop over years. Talented enough to compete immediately, mentally tough enough to handle the franchise's baggage, he was exactly what rebuilding teams dream about. And Stefanski was wasting him. What made the situation especially frustrating was the visibility. Everyone could see what was happening. Analysts noticed the lack of practice reps. Fans noticed the inconsistent usage. Former players spoke out about the obvious mismanagement. And yet nothing changed. The approach remained rigid. The results remained disappointing. Some within the organization reportedly grew frustrated. Players who watched Sanders work every day knew his preparation exceeded his opportunities. They saw his talent up close and couldn't understand why coaching wasn't maximizing it. The disconnect between Sanders' ability and his usage became a topic of quiet conversation. Looking back, the Sanders situation encapsulated everything wrong with Stefanski's tenure: the inability to develop young talent, the rigid commitment to approaches that weren't working, the apparent prioritization of coach ego over player growth. All the elements that had doomed previous quarterbacks were present again, playing out in slow motion for everyone to witness. And then came the game that made everything undeniable. Some games reveal more than final scores. Some games expose everything a coach is and everything a coach isn't. The Tennessee Titans matchup became that game for Kevin Stefanski. And by the time the final whistle blew, no one could pretend anymore. The night started like so many Cleveland games during this era: struggles, frustration, a team seemingly heading toward another forgettable loss. The Browns looked stuck, unable to generate consistent offense or build any momentum. Fans watching at home were already mentally checking out. Another week, another disappointment, another question mark next to the franchise's name. Then Shedeur Sanders took over. What happened next should have been the beginning of something special. Instead, it became the most damning evidence of coaching failure we've seen in recent memory. Sanders was sensational. There's no other word for it. 4 touchdown passes, not cheap scores or garbage time statistics. Real touchdowns that mattered. Throws that required anticipation, accuracy, and confidence under pressure. He stood in the pocket when rushers came. He delivered strikes when windows were tight. He commanded the offense like someone who had been doing it for a decade. The stadium felt the shift. That electric current that runs through crowds when something special is happening took hold. Teammates responded to Sanders' energy. The huddle had purpose again. Plays that had been stalling suddenly found new life. And most importantly, Cleveland was back in a game that had looked lost. This is the moment great coaches recognize and embrace. When a young quarterback is playing beyond expectations, you feed that fire. You ride the hot hand. You let confidence build because confidence is the most valuable commodity a quarterback can possess. Everything in conventional coaching wisdom says trust what's working. Stay aggressive. Let your best player be your best player. Stefanski did the opposite. With the game on the line and one final drive needed to complete the comeback, he made a decision that stunned everyone watching. He pulled Shedeur Sanders. The quarterback who had just thrown 4 touchdowns was suddenly standing on the sideline, watching instead of playing. The offensive identity flipped completely. Cleveland went from air attack to ground game in the most critical moment. Isaiah Judkins became the focus. The same creativity and explosiveness that had dragged the Browns back into contention was abandoned for a philosophy that hadn't been working all night. You could almost hear the air leave the stadium. The momentum that Sanders had built evaporated instantly. The rhythm disappeared. The confidence that had been growing with every completion vanished. And the Titans, who had been reeling moments earlier, suddenly regrouped. The final drive was a disaster. Execution fell apart. Plays that needed precision looked sloppy. The timing that had been developing disappeared entirely. Cleveland didn't just lose the game. They handed it away through a coaching decision that defied every logical principle. Let's be absolutely clear about what happened. This loss was not on Shedeur Sanders. He had done everything asked of him and more. He had answered every question with his performance on the field. He had proven that he could compete at the highest level when given the opportunity. And at the moment when his team needed him most, his coach removed him from the equation. This loss was not on the defense. They had given Cleveland chances. They had made stops when stops were needed. They had held up their end of the competitive bargain. The defense did enough to win that football game. This loss was on Kevin Stefanski. It was a coaching decision that backfired in real time, visible to everyone watching. And it wasn't an isolated incident. It was the same pattern repeating itself yet again. A young quarterback shows promise, and Stefanski finds a way to undermine it. The aftermath was brutal. Sports media dissected the decision from every angle. Former players expressed disbelief. Fans who had momentarily allowed themselves to hope were left more frustrated than ever. The The narrative around Stefanski shifted from unlucky coach in a tough situation to coach who doesn't trust his own players. What made it worse was the silence afterward. There was no satisfying explanation offered, no admission that the decision was wrong, just the same measured coach speak that had become Stefanski's trademark. And in that silence, frustration grew. Because accountability requires acknowledgement. It requires admitting when you've made mistakes, and Stefanski seemed incapable of providing either. The Titans game became a reference point. Whenever discussions about Stefanski's quarterback management came up afterward, this game was Exhibit A, the moment when everyone could see with their own eyes that something was fundamentally wrong with how this coach handled his most important players. Some defended Stefanski by pointing to game situations and strategic calculations. They argued that running the ball was sound theory given certain circumstances. But theory doesn't win games. Execution wins games. And the execution Cleveland needed was sitting on the sideline wearing a helmet he should have been using. The talented young quarterback who had just proven he belonged was denied the chance to finish what he started. The team that had finally found momentum watched it disappear because their coach didn't trust what he was seeing. And a game that should have been a signature win became another signature loss. Looking back, the Titans game represents the clearest snapshot of Stefanski's Cleveland tenure. Talent undermined by decision-making. Promise stalled by rigidity. Opportunity wasted by philosophy that prioritized control over success. What happened on that field was bad enough. But what allegedly happened off it was even more disturbing. Football happens on the field, but cultures are built in locker rooms, meeting rooms, and private conversations that the public never sees. And according to multiple reports, the culture Kevin Stefanski created in Cleveland had serious problems that went far beyond play calling decisions or game management mistakes. The allegations that emerged paint a troubling picture of an environment where questioning decisions carried consequences, where players who spoke up found themselves quietly pushed aside, where the appearance of control mattered more than the reality of collaboration. Before diving into specifics, it's important to note that many of these claims come from anonymous sources and haven't been independently verified in full. What we're discussing are reports and allegations that have circulated within NFL circles, not confirmed facts. But when multiple reports point in the same direction, the pattern becomes worth examining. The most disturbing allegations involve the misuse of injury designations. According to reports, players were removed from games or the active roster under the label of injury despite being healthy and ready to play. If true, that's not just poor leadership. That's a fundamental breach of trust between coach and players. Injury reports serve specific purposes in professional football. They inform opponents about player availability. They protect players by ensuring proper medical attention. They maintain competitive integrity across the league. When those reports become tools for roster manipulation rather than honest medical disclosure, the entire system breaks down. The allegations specifically involving Shedeur Sanders are particularly alarming. Reports suggest that Stefanski listed Sanders as injured on multiple occasions, despite there being no legitimate medical reason preventing him from playing. The injury designations appeared to be convenient shields, ways to justify not playing a quarterback the coach either didn't trust or didn't want to admit he had mishandled. Think about what that means for a moment. A young player trying to establish himself in the league, working every day to prove he belongs, and finding himself labeled injured when he's fully healthy. The message that sends is devastating. It tells the player his preparation doesn't matter. It tells teammates they can't trust what they're being told. It creates confusion and resentment that poisons everything. Even more troubling are the broader cultural implications. If injury reports were being manipulated for one player, questions naturally arise about whether the practice was more widespread. Were other players affected? Were veterans who asked uncomfortable questions suddenly finding themselves listed as unavailable? The allegations open doors that lead to very dark places. Some within NFL circles have speculated about possible motivations. One theory suggests that Sanders simply didn't fit the rigid offensive vision Stefanski had committed to. Another theory is even more damaging. Playing Sanders successfully would have forced Stefanski to acknowledge that his earlier decisions were wrong. Decisions like denying Sanders first-team reps. Decisions like delaying his development. Decisions like the Titans game catastrophe. Admitting mistakes requires humility. It requires prioritizing team success over personal ego. And according to the picture these reports paint, that kind of admission wasn't something Stefanski was willing to make. The cultural problems allegedly extended beyond just injury manipulation. Reports suggest an environment where dissent was discouraged, where players who questioned coaching decisions found their roles mysteriously reduced, where the flow of accountability only moved in one direction, from players to coaches, never the reverse. That kind of culture is poison for football teams. The best organizations thrive on honest communication. Players need to feel comfortable raising concerns. Coaches need to hear feedback from the people executing their schemes. When that feedback loop breaks down, problems fester instead of getting solved. Multiple anonymous sources have described frustration within the Cleveland locker room during Stefanski's final seasons. Players reportedly felt unheard. Veterancy questioned whether their experience was valued. Young players felt confused about their roles and futures. The dysfunction was apparently visible to anyone paying close attention. What makes these allegations particularly significant is how they connect to the on-field failures. When trust breaks down between coaches and players, performance suffers. When players don't believe in the system, effort decreases. When communication fails, execution falls apart. The alleged cultural problems and the visible competitive failures weren't separate issues. They were symptoms of the same disease. It's worth emphasizing again that these remain allegations. Not every report has been confirmed. Not every claim can be independently verified. But the volume and consistency of what's been reported demands attention. Smoke doesn't always mean fire, but when this much smoke appears, investigation is warranted. The NFL has mechanisms for addressing some of these concerns. If injury report manipulation occurred, league investigations could follow. If workplace culture created hostile conditions, players have avenues for reporting. But those processes move slowly, and the damage to careers and development happens in real time. What's undeniable is that something was deeply wrong in Cleveland during Stefanski's tenure. Whether the explanations are coaching philosophy failures, cultural breakdowns, alleged manipulation, or some combination of all three, the results speak clearly. 13 quarterbacks, no success stories. A franchise left worse off than when Stefanski arrived. And then another major voice entered the conversation, making the case even more compelling. When Stephen A. Smith weighs in on a controversy, the conversation amplifies immediately. Love him or question his style, the man commands attention. His platform reaches millions. His opinions shape narratives. And when he turned his focus to Kevin Stefanski, the already intense debate around the fired coach escalated to new levels. Smith didn't hedge. He didn't offer diplomatic both sides analysis. He came with the same directness that Cam Newton had displayed, and he brought receipts of his own. His verdict on Stefanski was clear and unsparing. The firing wasn't controversial. It was necessary. The core of Smith's argument centered on the same statistic that had dominated every discussion about Stefanski's tenure: 13 quarterbacks in 6 seasons. Smith repeated that number with emphasis, letting it sink in for viewers who might not have fully grasped its significance. He posed a simple question that cut through all the noise. Somewhere along the way, doesn't the coach have responsibility for not developing anyone? That question is deceptively powerful because it forces acknowledgement of a basic truth. Coaches are hired to develop players. That's the job. When development consistently fails across multiple players and multiple years, the coach has failed at the fundamental purpose of employment. No amount of scheme brilliance or media relationships can change that reality. Smith went further, directly challenging the idea that Stefanski would automatically land another head coaching position. Dan Orlovsky had suggested that Stefanski's return to a sideline was essentially guaranteed. That franchises would line up for his services, that his coaching ability was beyond question despite Cleveland's struggles. Smith pushed back hard. He argued that the quarterback carousel alone should give any reasonable front office pause. Because if you're a team looking for stability, if you're a franchise trying to build sustainable success, why would you hire a coach who just went through 13 quarterbacks without developing a single one? What evidence suggests the 14th attempt would be different? The rhetorical brilliance of Smith's approach was in forcing Stefanski's defenders to actually reckon with the record. It's easy to say a coach is respected around the league. It's harder to explain why respect should override 6 years of failed quarterback development. It's comfortable to mention Coach of the Year awards. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge that awards don't win games or develop talent. Smith also highlighted specific quarterback situations that reflected poorly on Stefanski's tenure. He mentioned Baker Mayfield, who arrived as the #1 overall pick with legitimate franchise quarterback potential. Cleveland moved on from Mayfield, and he subsequently found success in Tampa Bay. That outcome raises obvious questions. Was the problem really Mayfield, or was the problem the environment he was playing in? The Deshaun Watson situation received attention as well. Smith acknowledged that Watson bore personal responsibility for his struggles, but he emphasized that the on-field decline happened on Stefanski's watch. A quarterback who had been genuinely special in Houston became something else entirely in Cleveland. Coaching should have helped prevent or at least minimize that decline. Instead, Watson just kept getting worse. What made Smith's critique particularly effective was his refusal to accept excuses. Every defense of Stefanski involves pointing to factors outside his control: ownership decisions, front office moves, injury luck. And while some of those factors genuinely contributed to Cleveland's struggles, Smith argued they couldn't explain away everything. A 2-time Coach of the Year should be able to navigate difficult circumstances. A respected offensive mind should be able to adapt schemes to available talent. A quality leader should be able to develop at least one quarterback into something valuable over 6 seasons. When none of that happens, the excuses become deflection rather than explanation. Smith also touched on the accountability double standard that exists in sports media. Certain coaches receive protection that their records don't justify. Their failures get blamed on circumstances. Their successes get attributed entirely to their genius. Meanwhile, players face constant scrutiny for every mistake, every bad game, every moment of inconsistency. The question Smith implicitly raised was why Stefanski deserved protection. What had he actually accomplished that warranted ongoing benefit of the doubt? A playoff appearance years earlier? A Coach of the Year award that looked increasingly questionable given subsequent results? The foundation for defending Stefanski was shakier than his supporters wanted to admit. What Smith's intervention accomplished was legitimizing the criticism. When a voice as prominent as his echoes the same concerns Cam Newton raised, the argument gains weight. It becomes harder for Stefanski defenders to dismiss criticism as hot takes or uninformed opinions. The sample size of critics now included former players and major media personalities. The consensus was forming. Smith emphasized that this wasn't personal. He had no apparent grudge against Stefanski. He was simply reading the evidence and drawing logical conclusions. 13 quarterbacks, no franchise solutions, a team that finished below expectations repeatedly. Those facts demanded accountability, and accountability had finally arrived. The combination of Newton's initial critique and Smith's amplification created a narrative that Stefanski couldn't escape. 2 different voices from 2 different backgrounds arriving at the same conclusion. The coach had failed at his most important responsibility, and no amount of spin could change that verdict. This wasn't just about one coach anymore. This was about 2 completely different views of what coaching actually means. The clash between Dan Orlovsky and Cam Newton wasn't just a disagreement about one coach. It was a collision between 2 fundamentally different philosophies about football, leadership, and accountability. Understanding that deeper conflict explains why this particular debate resonated so powerfully with fans and analysts alike. Orlovsky represents what we might call the analyst perspective. Former player turned media commentator, he approaches football intellectually. He values scheme design, play concepts, and coaching philosophy as abstract disciplines. In his framework, coaches should be evaluated primarily on their theoretical knowledge and strategic innovation. The whiteboard matters most. The design of the offense or defense reveals coaching quality. From this perspective, Stefanski remains defensible. His offensive concepts are sophisticated. His play designs show creativity. His approach demonstrates genuine understanding of how to attack defenses schematically. If football were played on paper, Stefanski would be among the league's elite coaches. But football isn't played on paper. It's played on grass and turf by human beings who need development, trust, confidence, and proper management to perform their best. And that's where Newton's perspective becomes essential. Newton speaks from lived experience inside NFL locker rooms. He knows what it feels like to be a quarterback searching for stability. He understands the dynamics between coaches and players that never make broadcast television. He's experienced both great coaching and terrible coaching throughout his career. His evaluation isn't theoretical. It's visceral and personal. In Newton's framework, coaches are judged by results and development. Can you make players better? Can you create environments where talent flourishes? Can you make decisions in critical moments that help your team win? These aren't abstract questions. They're the fundamental measures of coaching quality. When evaluated against Newton's standards, Stefanski fails dramatically. 13 quarterbacks with no development, critical game decisions that backfired, an apparent inability to trust his own players in pressure moments. Whatever scheme brilliance existed on the whiteboard, it never translated into on-field results through quarterback play. The disconnect between these perspectives explains why the debate became so heated. Orlovsky was defending Stefanski based on criteria that Newton considers secondary at best. Newton was attacking Stefanski based on criteria that Orlovsky seems to undervalue. They were essentially speaking different languages while appearing to discuss the same topic. What made Newton's argument more compelling to most observers was its alignment with common sense. Casual fans don't evaluate coaches based on scheme complexity. They evaluate based on wins, losses, and whether the team looks functional. By every common sense measure, Cleveland was dysfunctional under Stefanski. The evidence was visible every Sunday. Orlovsky's defense also suffered from its detachment from player experience. When a former MVP tells you that coaching failed, that carries weight. Newton has been in those locker rooms. He's experienced both sides of the development equation. His criticism came from genuine understanding, not just statistical analysis. The debate also exposed how media relationships can distort coaching narratives. Stefanski is by all accounts a pleasant interview, a cooperative media presence, and someone who handles press conferences professionally. Those qualities create goodwill among the people who cover the league. That goodwill can translate into protective coverage that doesn't always match reality. Newton essentially called out this dynamic without naming it directly. He pushed back against the idea that reputation should override results, that being liked by media members should provide cover for competitive failures. That professional demeanor should matter more than actual performance. There's also a class dimension worth acknowledging. Media analysts often identify more with coaches than players. They see themselves in the strategic thinking, the long-term planning, the intellectual exercise of football. Players represent something different, more physical, more momentary, more expendable from certain perspectives. Newton was defending players, not just himself, but the entire class of quarterbacks who cycled through Cleveland without proper support. He was speaking for Shedeur Sanders, who deserved better development. For Baker Mayfield, who might have thrived in a different environment. For every quarterback who entered that system with hope and departed with questions. That advocacy matters because players often lack platforms to speak for themselves. They have contracts to protect, futures to consider, relationships to maintain. Newton has the security and platform to say what others might think, but can't express. His willingness to use that platform for accountability rather than just self-promotion elevated the entire conversation. The lasting impact of this debate extends beyond Stefanski's individual case. It forced audiences to consider what they actually value in coaching. Are we satisfied with sophisticated schemes that don't produce results? Do we accept endless excuses for quarterback development failures? How long should patience extend when evidence keeps pointing in the same direction? Newton's position represents a demand for higher standards. A refusal to grade on curves or accept circumstances as permanent excuses, an insistence that coaches be held accountable for the responsibilities they're paid millions of dollars to fulfill. Orlovsky's position represents something more comfortable, a willingness to find explanations for failure, a tendency to trust credentials over outcomes, a preference for technical analysis over blunt assessment. Both perspectives have value in sports discourse. But when the evidence is as overwhelming as it was in Stefanski's case, Newton's perspective simply matches reality better. 13 quarterbacks and no success isn't a debate topic. It's a verdict. And when you step back and look at everything together, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Kevin Stefanski's Cleveland tenure ended, but the lessons extend far beyond one coach and one franchise. What happened with the Browns represents a case study in how organizations fail when fundamental responsibilities get ignored or mishandled, and those lessons should resonate throughout the NFL. The most obvious takeaway involves quarterback development. In the modern league, nothing matters more than the position. Championships flow through elite quarterback play. Playoff hopes depend on stability under center. Organizations that solve the quarterback question can compete for years. Organizations that don't solve it drift in mediocrity regardless of other roster strengths. Cleveland had resources, draft capital, cap space, and organizational commitment to finding quarterback solutions. They invested heavily in the position through trades, contracts, and draft selections. Yet none of it worked because the developmental environment was broken. This should be a warning sign for every franchise currently struggling with their quarterback situation. Talent isn't enough. Investment isn't enough. You need coaching that actually develops players, creates confidence, and puts people in positions to succeed. Without that coaching, all the resources in the world won't matter. The Stefanski situation also highlights how coaching evaluation often goes wrong. Awards and reputation can obscure actual performance. Stefanski won Coach of the Year twice, yet his tenure ended in failure. Those awards were based on specific seasons evaluated in isolation. When you zoom out and look at the full body of work, the picture changes dramatically. Front offices considering coaching hires need to look deeper than surface credentials. What is the coach's track record with quarterback development specifically? How does the coach handle young players versus veterans? What decisions get made in pressure moments? Is the coach adaptable or rigid? These questions matter more than resume lines or industry reputation. The accountability gap exposed during the Stefanski debate demands attention as well. For too long, certain coaches received protection from media that their records didn't justify. Players faced constant scrutiny, while coaches hid behind complexity and circumstances. That imbalance is unfair and ultimately counterproductive for the sport. Cam Newton's willingness to challenge the narrative represents what sports discourse should look like. Honest assessment from people who understand the game. Refusal to accept endless excuses. Demand for results that match resources. When former players speak up about coaching failures, their voices deserve attention precisely because they understand dynamics that outside observers miss. The alleged cultural issues in Cleveland raise separate but related concerns. If reports about injury manipulation and dissent suppression are accurate, the problems extend beyond football strategy into workplace dysfunction. Players deserve environments where they can trust their coaches, where honest communication is valued, and where roster decisions are based on genuine considerations rather than political maneuvering. Organizations across the league should examine their own cultures in light of what allegedly happened in Cleveland. Are players comfortable raising concerns? Do coaches accept feedback or punish it? Are injury reports accurate or convenient? These questions matter for player well-being, competitive integrity, and organizational health. Looking forward, Stefanski's next opportunity will be fascinating to observe. If he lands another head coaching position, it will test whether the lessons from Cleveland have been absorbed. Will he approach quarterback development differently? Will he show more trust in young players during critical moments? Will cultural dynamics improve? The answers will reveal whether this experience produced growth or just resentment. For Cleveland specifically, the path forward requires honest assessment of what went wrong and commitment to different approaches. The next coaching hire must prioritize quarterback development above other considerations. The organizational culture needs rebuilding. Trust between front office, coaching staff, and players must be reestablished. The broader NFL benefits from situations like this being analyzed publicly. Transparency about coaching failures creates pressure for improvement. When the league sees what happens when development gets neglected, attention to development increases elsewhere. When manipulation allegations surface, organizations become more careful about practices that could damage their reputations. What Cam Newton accomplished through his critique extends beyond one debate on one show. He elevated expectations for coaching accountability. He gave voice to concerns that players often suppress. He demonstrated that media narratives can be challenged when evidence supports different conclusions. The question moving forward is whether the league learns from Cleveland's example or repeats the same mistakes elsewhere. Quarterback development isn't optional. It's the job. Coaches who fail at it repeatedly should face consequences regardless of other credentials. Organizations that tolerate dysfunction invite continued failure. Stefanski's era didn't end abruptly. It ended inevitably. The evidence accumulated over years, becoming impossible to ignore. 13 quarterbacks and no solutions isn't noise. It's the signal. And ignoring signals eventually catches up with everyone. The best organizations will study what went wrong and commit to different paths. The best coaches will recognize that development matters more than schemes. The best front offices will evaluate coaching candidates based on actual results rather than reputation alone. Cleveland's failure can become the league's lesson, but only if the right conclusions get drawn and the right changes get made. The alternative is watching the same cycles repeat in different cities with different names but identical outcomes. That's the bigger picture. That's what this moment represents. Not just one coach's failure, but an opportunity for the entire sport to raise its standards. 13 quarterbacks, 6 seasons, 0 franchise solutions. That's the record. That's the verdict. And no amount of scheme talk or media protection can change it. Kevin Stefanski had more opportunities than most coaches ever receive at the most important position in sports. He failed every single time. The quarterback carousel wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern revealing something fundamentally broken. Cam Newton saw it clearly and said it loudly. Stephen A. Smith amplified the message, and the evidence supported everything they claimed. Development isn't optional in the NFL. It's the primary job responsibility for any head coach. When you cycle through player after player without elevating anyone, leadership itself becomes the question mark. The allegations about culture and manipulation only deepen concerns that already existed. The Titans' game decision only confirmed what observers suspected. And the contrast between Stefanski's protection and his actual results only highlighted how disconnected certain narratives had become from reality. Cleveland's failure should serve as a warning. Talent and resources mean nothing without proper coaching. Reputation means nothing without results. And accountability must eventually find everyone, no matter how long it takes.